Archivist had spent 47 years working with numbers. Numbers were clean. Numbers were honest. They told stories that words could never tell, and they never lied if you asked the right questions. In all her time serving the Galactic Administrative Council, she had never met a number she could not eventually understand. Until today. She sat in her small office on Station Meridian, surrounded by floating displays that cast pale blue light across her gray-green skin. Her 4 eyes blinked in sequence as she ran the calculation again. Then again. Then a 4th time because surely she had made an error somewhere. The Universal Loss Registry was one of the most important databases in Council space. Every member species was required to submit their casualty records from military operations, emergency services, and disaster response. The data went back thousands of years for some species, and it painted a clear picture of how civilizations handled death in service of others. The pattern was always the same. When governments forced their citizens to serve through mandatory conscription, those conscripts died in larger numbers than volunteers. This made simple sense. Conscription filled the ranks with millions of bodies. Volunteers were rare and precious. The mathematics were elementary. Had reviewed the records of 847 species. Every single one followed this pattern. The crystalline collective, the swarm minds of outer reach. All of them showed mandatory service deaths outnumbering volunteer deaths by ratios of anywhere from 3-to-1 to 50-to-1. Then there were the humans. She pulled up their file again and felt her secondary hearts beat faster with confusion. The numbers made no sense. Human volunteer deaths exceeded their mandatory service deaths by a factor of 12, not slightly more. Not a minor statistical variation. 12 times as many humans died by choice than died by order. Submitted a formal query to the human embassy, certain that someone had entered the data incorrectly. Perhaps a decimal point in the wrong place. Perhaps a translation error between human counting systems and the universal standard. These things happened. The response came 3 hours later. It was not the correction she expected. Instead, it was a personal invitation from the human ambassador to visit their embassy on Earth's orbital station. Ambassador Wei wished to discuss the matter in person. This was unusual. Most species simply sent a correction notice or a brief explanation. They did not invite archivists to travel across 3 systems for a conversation. The journey took 4 days. Spent most of it reviewing human history, trying to find some explanation for the anomaly. What she found only confused her more. Humans had fought wars against each other for most of their existence. They had invented increasingly efficient ways to kill their own kind. They had nearly destroyed there through environmental neglect. By all measures, they should have been a species that valued survival above all else. And yet the numbers said otherwise. Ambassador Wei was a small woman with dark hair and tired eyes. She greeted at the embassy entrance with what humans called a smile, though it seemed to carry more weight than happiness. "Archivist," she said, "thank you for making the journey. I know the data must seem strange to you." "Strange is not a strong enough word," replied. "The numbers appear to be impossible." "They are accurate," said. "I checked them myself when your query arrived. I wanted to be certain before we had this conversation." "How can they be accurate? No species in recorded history shows this pattern. Voluntary death should never exceed mandatory death on such a scale. The mathematics of population alone should prevent it." Nodded slowly. "You are correct that the mathematics should prevent it, and yet here we are." She gestured toward the corridor behind her. "I think it would be easier to show you than to explain. Would you be willing to travel a bit further?" Agreed, though she did not understand what there was to see. Led her to a small shuttle bay, and within an hour they were moving through space toward a destination the ambassador would not name. The planet they approached was dead. Could see that from orbit. The surface was scorched and cracked, the atmosphere thin and poisonous. Whatever life had once existed here was long gone. 442b said quietly. 17 years ago, the star in this system became unstable. We had 17 days warning before it released a massive solar flare that would sterilize the planet. The colony said. She remembered reading about it in the historical records. 4 million had lived on this world. Yes, 4 million colonists, and no way to evacuate them in time using their own ships. The government sent out a distress call to the council, requesting 50 advisors to help coordinate an emergency response. The shuttle docked at a small station orbiting the dead world. It was old and clearly maintained only as a memorial site, led through the entrance and into a long corridor that opened into a vast circular chamber. The walls were covered with names. Thousands of names, written in human script, etched into black stone that stretched from floor to ceiling. Turned slowly, trying to count them, trying to understand what she was seeing. 112 humans volunteered for the evacuation mission, said. Her voice was soft, almost reverent. They asked for 50 advisors. 112 humans showed up within 3 days. They piloted ships. They organized loading procedures. They carried children and elderly who could not move quickly enough. They worked for 17 days without sleep, using stimulants to keep themselves functional. And the outcome? Every colonist survived. 4 million lives saved. Paused. 97 humans died, some from exhaustion, some from accidents during the rushed evacuations. 15 died when the flare hit earlier than predicted, and they stayed behind to launch the last transport ships. Stared at the wall of names. 97 humans, such a small number compared to 4 million, and yet they had not been ordered to come. They had not been conscripted or threatened or bribed. Why did so many come? She asked. Your government only needed 50. Smiled that tired smile again. We did not ask them to come, they just came. I do not understand. I know, walked closer to the wall and touched one of the names gently. My grandmother's name is here. She was a cargo pilot, retired, 64 years old. She heard the distress call and flew her personal ship across 3 systems to help. I asked her once why she did it, why she risked everything for people she had never met, people who were not even her own species. What did she say? Was quiet for a moment. She said she could not sit at home knowing that children were going to burn. She said the thought of it made her chest hurt so badly that she could not breathe. She said that going was the only thing that made the pain stop. Processed this information slowly. She had studied empathy in dozens of species. It was a common trait, evolved in social creatures as a way to promote group cohesion. But empathy usually had limits. It usually diminished with distance, with difference, with time. Many species feel empathy, she said carefully. It does not usually drive them to death. No, agreed. It does not. She turned to face directly. Humans are not more empathetic than other species. We are simply unable to escape our imagination. When we hear that someone is suffering, we do not just feel sad for them. We imagine being them. We feel the fear they feel. We experience their pain as if it were our own. That sounds like a psychological disorder. Laugh softly. Perhaps it is, but it is also what brought 112 humans across 3 systems to save 4 million strangers. She looked back at the wall of names. We cannot watch someone drown and stay on the shore. The drowning feeling fills our lungs before we even enter the water, and the only way to make it stop is to swim. Stood in the memorial chamber for a long time after finished speaking. She looked at the names and tried to imagine what it would feel like to be so connected to strangers that their deaths felt like personal failures. She could not quite grasp it, but she was beginning to understand that the numbers she had found were not errors. They were something far more unusual. They were the truth. She returned to Station Meridian 3 days later and began drafting her preliminary report to the council. She wrote that the human data was accurate and that further investigation was warranted. She did not yet have the words to explain what she had learned, but she knew that she had stumbled onto something important. The Universal Loss Registry had revealed an anomaly, and that anomaly had a name. Humanity. The investigation took across 7 systems over the following months. She had been given full access to the Human Volunteer Corps Historical Database, a collection of records that stretched back nearly 300 years to humanity's first ventures beyond there. What she found there kept her awake during her rest cycles, turning the information over in her mind like a stone she could not stop touching. The pattern repeated itself everywhere she looked. On Meridian 7, a world inhabited by a disease called the Hollow Plague had swept through the population 60 years ago. The plague dissolved the exoskeletons of its victims from the inside out, leaving them in constant agony until death. No cure existed. Medical researchers across the council worked frantically to develop treatments, but every experimental approach required test subjects. They could not use their own people. The plague killed too quickly for meaningful data collection. Humans volunteered. Read the records with growing disbelief. 217 humans had offered themselves as test subjects within the first month of the research program. They were not scientists. They were not soldiers. They were ordinary people who heard that strangers were dying and decided to inject themselves with experimental compounds that might kill them. 43 of them died. The 44th test subject survived long enough for researchers to identify the compound that eventually became the cure. Her name was. She had been a music teacher before volunteering. She spent the last 3 months of her life in a medical facility, her body slowly failing, writing letters to her students that she asked the doctors to deliver after her death. Found copies of those letters in the archive. She read one of them and had to stop. The human woman had written to a child named, telling him to practice his scales and remember that music was a gift you gave to others, not to yourself. She signed it with something called a heart symbol. The Hollow Plague was cured 8 months after died. 12 million were saved. Moved on to the hegemony records. 23 years ago, the had collapsed into a brutal civil war that lasted almost a decade. The fighting was concentrated in urban areas, and millions of civilians were trapped between the warring factions. Council peacekeeping forces could not intervene without being drawn into the conflict themselves. Human relief workers entered anyway. They did not wait for permission. They did not negotiate safe passage. They loaded their ships with food and medical supplies and flew directly into active combat zones. When military commanders from both sides warned them to leave, they refused. When shots were fired near their camps, they stayed. When 3 of them were killed by a stray artillery shell, the others held a funeral and continued working. The most remarkable incident occurred in the city of, where 2 factions had been fighting street by street for 3 months. A human woman named Sarah walked into the middle of a firefight carrying a white flag. She stood between the 2 groups and refused to move. Both sides stopped shooting. She told them that there were children in the building behind her who had not eaten in 4 days. She told them that she did not care about their war or their politics or their ancient grievances. She told them that she was going to walk into that building and bring those children out, and if they wanted to shoot her, they were welcome to try. Neither side fired. Sarah walked into the building and emerged carrying 2 small children, one under each arm. She walked past the soldiers without looking at them and brought the children to her relief camp. The fighting in that sector paused for 6 hours. It was the first ceasefire of the war. Found a recording of an interview with Sarah conducted years after the conflict ended. The interviewer asked her if she had been afraid to walk into the firefight. "Of course I was afraid," Sarah said. "I thought I was going to die. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely walk." "Then why did you do it?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Because I could hear those children crying, and I could not make the sound go away, so I had to do something, even if the something was stupid and got me killed." Watched the recording 3 times. She studied Sarah's face, looking for signs of mental instability or psychological damage. She found none. The woman appeared entirely rational. She simply seemed unable to tolerate the suffering of others. The Deep Space Rescue Service was perhaps the most puzzling case of all. It was an entirely volunteer organization that operated a fleet of 47 ships, crewed exclusively by humans who spent years at a time in the empty spaces between star systems. Their mission was simple. They responded to distress signals. Not all distress signals. Many calls for help were easily answered by Council emergency services or military vessels. The Deep Space Rescue Service only responded to the calls that no one else would take. The impossible cases, the ships too far away, the disasters too dangerous, the situations that automated systems had calculated as unrecoverable. Spoke with the current director of the organization, a human named James. She noticed the surname and asked if he was related to Sarah from the relief mission. "My aunt," he said. "She died about 10 years ago. Old age, if you can believe it. Most people in my family don't get that luxury." He explained the history of the organization. It had been founded nearly 200 years ago by a group of retired military pilots who felt that too many distress calls went unanswered. They used their own money to buy ships and train their own crews. Over time, the organization grew as more humans volunteered. "We have a waiting list," James said. "About 3,000 people right now. They know what they are signing up for. They know the statistics. They come anyway." Asked about the statistics, James told her that the average service life for a deep space rescue volunteer was 4 years. The mortality rate was approximately 60%. Most volunteers did not die on rescue missions. They died in the vast emptiness of space, waiting for calls that came too late, or responding to disasters that killed them alongside the people they were trying to save. "Why do they come?" asked. "Why does anyone choose this?" James considered the question carefully. "You know what the worst part of my job is? It is not the dying. It is the calls we cannot reach in time. Last year, we picked up a distress signal from a transport ship carrying 300 pilgrims. Engine failure. They were drifting toward a gas giant. We calculated that we could reach them with about 6 hours to spare before they hit the atmosphere." He paused. His expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "We were wrong. Our calculations were off by 9 hours. We arrived just in time to watch them burn." "And yet you continue." "Yes." "Why?" James looked at her for a long moment. "Because next time, maybe we will not be too late, and if we stop trying, then we definitely will be." Interviewed one more human before submitting her preliminary report to the council. His name was, and he was James's father and Sarah's brother. He was a retired deep space rescue operator who had served for 12 years before an accident destroyed both his legs and covered 60% of his body in burned scars. He lived in a small apartment on Earth's orbital station. When arrived, he greeted her with a smile and offered her something called tea, which she politely declined. "You want to know why we do it," he said before she could ask her first question. "Everyone wants to know. The council, the other species, sometimes even other humans. They look at the numbers and they cannot understand." "That is correct," admitted. "The mathematics are irrational. Voluntary death should not exceed mandatory death. It defies the basic principles of self-preservation." Nodded slowly. "Let me ask you something. Have you ever seen someone in danger, someone who was about to die right in front of you?" Thought back. "No, my work has always been administrative." "I see. Well, let me tell you what it feels like for us. When a human sees someone in danger, something happens in our brains. We do not just observe the situation, we experience it. We feel ourselves falling. We feel ourselves drowning. We feel ourselves burning. Our minds put us inside the body of the person who is suffering and we cannot get out." He tapped his chest with one hand. "It is not just empathy, it is imagination. We can picture our own death so clearly that watching someone else die feels like dying ourselves. And the only way to make that feeling stop is to act, to do something, anything. That sounds like a form of psychological compulsion, said carefully. Laughed. It was a warm sound despite everything. Maybe it is. Maybe we are all a little bit broken, but that brokenness has saved a lot of lives, including many that were not human. He leaned forward in his chair, his prosthetic legs clicking softly. You want to know the real secret? It is not that we are brave, we are terrified. We are always terrified, but fear does not stop us because something else is stronger. We cannot watch someone drown and stay on the shore. We just cannot. It breaks something inside us that is more important than survival. Completed her preliminary report that evening. She wrote that the human data was accurate and that the anomaly represented a genuine psychological phenomenon rather than a statistical error. She noted that this phenomenon appeared to be species-wide and consistent across historical periods. She recommended further study. The council received her report with mixed reactions. Some members suggested that human psychology represented a form of instability that should be monitored carefully. Others proposed that this trait could be exploited for military purposes, using humans as a source of willing soldiers for dangerous operations. Disagreed with both positions, but she did not yet have the words to explain why. All she knew was that she had met 3 members of the same family who had dedicated their lives to saving strangers. One was dead. One was beyond recognition. One was still flying into the darkness, waiting for distress signals that might never come. And all 3 of them had smiled when they told her their stories. She did not understand it, but she was beginning to feel something she could not quite name, something that made her chest ache when she thought about writing letters to her students while she was dying, something that made her think about the wall of names on 442B, something that might, in its own small way, be the beginning of understanding. The war came without warning. Was in her office on Station Meridian when the first reports arrived. The architect's swarm had entered council space, emerging from the darkness between galaxies like a tide of metal and hunger. No one knew where it came from or why it had chosen this moment to appear. All they knew was what it did. It consumed. The swarm was a machine intelligence of unknown origin, vast beyond comprehension, and it fed on organic matter. It stripped worlds bare in weeks. It processed entire populations into fuel for its expansion. The first 3 systems it encountered were home to nearly 2 billion people. By the time Council scouts arrived to investigate, there was nothing left but dead rock and the faint traces of what might once have been cities. The Galactic Administrative Council convened an emergency session within hours. Representatives from all 847 member species gathered in the Great Chamber, their fear so palpable that could almost taste it in the recycled air. She had never seen the council so unified in its terror. The military projections were devastating. Admiral of the Defense Force presented the numbers in a flat voice that betrayed no emotion. The swarm's current trajectory would bring it through the heart of council space within 18 months. Mandatory conscription across all member species could field a combined force of approximately 400 million soldiers. Projected casualties to halt the swarm's advance were estimated at between 200 and 300 million. We may slow it, Admiral said. We will not stop it, not with these numbers, not with this technology. We can only delay the inevitable unless we find some other solution. The chamber erupted in arguments. Some species demanded immediate evacuation to the far edges of the galaxy. Others proposed surrender and negotiation, though no one knew if the swarm could even communicate. A few suggested preemptive strikes against the swarm's core, suicide missions that would certainly fail but might buy time. No one spoke of victory. No one believed it was possible. Then the human representative stood. Ambassador Wei looked smaller than ever in the vast chamber, a single fragile figure among the massive forms of species 10 times her size. But when she spoke, her voice carried clearly to every corner of the room. "Before this session continues," she said, "I must inform the Council of a development within the human territories." Admiral tilted his massive head. "What development?" Paused for a moment and saw something flicker across her face. It might have been pride, it might have been grief, it might have been both. In the 12 hours since news of the swarm reached human space, our volunteer registration system has received 300 million applications. The chamber fell silent, felt her secondary heart stutter. 300 million, Admiral repeated slowly. Volunteers in 12 hours. Yes, his voice did not waver. Our military processing centers are overwhelmed. We have had to implement emergency protocols to handle the volume. Even so, we are turning away applicants faster than we can register them. The current estimate is that the final volunteer count will exceed 400 million within the week. A representative from the Crystalline Collective spoke, their voice resonating through their quartz-like body. "These are soldiers, military personnel." "No," said, "most of them are not teachers, engineers, medical workers, parents, retired laborers, students, people who have never held a weapon in their lives." She looked around the chamber slowly. They heard that something was coming to kill strangers they have never met, and they could not stay home. The council did not know how to respond. Watched the representatives exchange glances, their confusion and disbelief evident in their body language. This was not how species behaved. This was not how survival worked. You did not throw yourself into the fire for people you had never seen. Unless you were human. The war lasted 11 years. Lived through all of it, though there were many times when she did not expect to survive the next month. She transferred from her administrative position to a coordination role in the Combined Forces Logistics Division, tracking supplies and casualties, and the endless flow of data that kept the war machine functioning. She learned to read the numbers not as abstractions but as lives, each digit representing someone who would not return home. The human volunteers fought in ways that military doctrine. They accepted missions with zero survival probability. They held defensive positions long after retreat was the rational choice. They flew damaged ships into swarm concentrations to create openings for others to escape. They died in numbers that made the other species sick to witness. Kept count, it was her job. It was the only thing she could do. The first year claimed 40 million human volunteers. The second year claimed another 60 million. By the fifth year, the volunteer death toll had passed 300 million, and still they kept coming. Every time the human forces suffered a devastating loss, fresh volunteers arrived to take their place. The registration centers never closed. The processing lines never shortened. She met one more time, 3 years into the war. He had been called back to active service despite his injuries, working as a tactical advisor for the Deep Space Rescue Service vessels that had been converted into combat ships. He looked older than she remembered, his scars deeper, his prosthetic legs heavier. "You should not be here," she told him. "You have given enough." Smiled that familiar smile. "I cannot watch from the shore, you know that. You understand it now, I think." She wanted to argue with him. She wanted to tell him that his life had value beyond sacrifice, that his family had already lost too much, that the war would continue whether he died or not. But she looked into his eyes and saw something that stopped her words. He was not afraid. He had made peace with what was coming, and there was something beautiful in that peace, something that made her chest ache in a way she had finally learned to recognize. "I understand," she said quietly. Nodded, "Then you know more than most." He died 7 months later. His ship was among a group that held the defensive line at 442B, buying time for a civilian evacuation fleet to escape. The same world where his family's story had begun. The same memorial station where had first learned what humans were capable of. When the war ended, returned to that station. The walls were covered with new names now, thousands and thousands of them, etched into black stone that seemed to stretch forever. She walked through the circular chamber slowly, reading names she did not recognize but somehow felt she knew. Ambassador Wei was there. She looked older too, her hair gray now, her tired eyes even more tired. But she smiled when she saw. "You came back," said. "I had to," looked at the walls of names. "I needed to finish my report." "The report on the anomaly." "Yes," was quiet for a moment. "I have been trying to write the conclusion for 11 years. I think I finally understand what to say." She had brought a small recording device with her. She activated it and began to speak, her voice steady despite everything. "This is the final report of Archivist regarding the anomaly in the Universal Loss Registry. The human volunteer death toll in the war against the Architect Swarm has reached 847 million, exceeding the mandatory service casualty count of all other member species combined. This confirms the pattern I identified at the beginning of my investigation." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "The explanation for this pattern is not psychological instability or evolutionary malfunction. Humans experience a form of suffering when they witness others in danger that can only be relieved through action. Their imagination places them inside the experience of the victim, and they cannot escape until they have done something to help. This is not a choice. It is not a calculation. It is simply how they are built." Was watching her quietly, continued. "This makes humans unreliable conscripts but invaluable allies. They cannot be ordered to care, but they cannot be prevented from caring either. Their loss registry is not a sign of recklessness or irrationality. It is evidence of something I have struggled to name." She thought of writing letters while she was dying. She thought of Sarah walking into the firefight. She thought of smiling through his scars. She thought of 300 million people registering to die for strangers in 12 hours. In human languages, there is a word called agape. It refers to a love that does not calculate, a love that does not protect itself, a love that does not ask permission. I believe this word is the closest translation for what I have observed. She turned off the recording device and stood in silence. The names on the walls seemed to press in around her, not with weight but with presence. All these people who had chosen to run toward the fire. "What will you do now?" asked. Considered the question. "I would like to learn more about human memorial practices, how you honor so many dead without breaking under the weight of it. I think I need to understand that before I can truly complete my work." Nodded slowly. "We have a saying, 3 words. It is the closest we have to an answer." "What is it?" Looked at the walls of names, and her tired eyes softened. "We remember forward." Did not fully understand what that meant, but she thought about the family, 3 generations who had given everything for strangers. She thought about the volunteers who were still registering even now, ready for the next disaster, the next threat, the next call for help that might never come. She thought about the drowning feeling that had described, the inability to watch someone suffer without feeling it yourself. She had never experienced it the way humans did. But standing in this chamber, surrounded by the names of the dead, she felt something close, a weight in her chest, an ache that demanded action. Perhaps that was what they meant by remembering forward, not dwelling on the loss but carrying it into the future, using the memory of the dead to fuel the protection of the living, honoring sacrifice not with monuments but with continued effort. She walked to the wall and found name. She touched it gently, the way she had seen touch her grandmother's name years ago. "I remember you forward," she said quietly. The words felt strange in her mouth, but they also felt right, and when she walked out of the memorial station, she carried them with her, along with the weight of 847 million names that she would never forget. The Universal Loss Registry would be updated to include the war casualties. The numbers would be staggering. They would confuse future archivists just as they had confused her. And someday, someone would ask the same question she had asked. Why do humans do this? When that day came, this report would be waiting, and it would say what she had finally learned to say. Because they cannot watch someone drown and stay on the shore. Because their imagination makes them feel every death as their own. Because the only way they know how to live is to keep swimming toward the people who are drowning. Even if it kills them. Especially if it kills them. That is what makes them human. That is what makes them impossible to understand. And that is what makes them, in the end, worth remembering.